The opening half of 1942 placed the Imperial Japanese Navy at the height of its operational reach. Yet beneath the outward momentum lay a strategic tension shaped by expanding front lines, dispersed commitments, and the pressure to achieve a decisive result before American industrial capacity fully mobilized. The Central Pacific remained quiet on the surface, but naval intelligence summaries and fleet movement reports circulating through the combined fleet headquarters suggested a shifting balance. Signals from American bases indicated rising activity. Submarine patrol patterns displayed new discipline. Logistic records revealed increases in aviation, fuel stockpiles at key Midway installations. The Japanese High Command examined these indicators in a piecemeal fashion, without fully integrating their implications. The region appeared distant and lightly defended, yet it remained strategically positioned between the Hawaiian archipelago and the broader Pacific communications network. Within this environment, the carriers of the First Air Fleet maintained a demanding operational schedule. Deck crews monitored the condition of aircraft engines strained by previous campaigns. Ordnance teams sorted through torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs, while maintenance logs showed repeated cycles of repair following the Indian Ocean raid. The flight decks bore the wear of constant operations, and the pace allowed little opportunity for systematic refurbishment. The crews understood their aircraft and machinery with precision, but long distances, limited resupply options, and weathered equipment created a gradual accumulation of operational friction. Even as the fleet projected strength, internal reports from engineering officers recorded shortages of key spare parts that would not be fully replenished before the next major operation. Across the Central Pacific, weather patterns reinforced the sense of precarious calm. High-level winds carried bands of tropical moisture northeastward, occasionally obscuring reconnaissance missions and complicating long-range seaplane flights. Observers aboard forward picket submarines noted variable cloud formations that hindered early detection of distant surface groups. Despite these conditions, the operational assumption among senior Japanese planners held that weather favored concealment for their own forces more than it imperiled detection of enemy formations. This belief contributed to confidence within the combined fleet that its intended approach toward Midway Atoll would remain unnoticed. The atoll itself appeared insignificant in scale, but possessed considerable strategic weight. A narrow landmass surrounding a shallow lagoon, Midway supported airstrips, fuel depots, anti-aircraft batteries, and a fortified communications hub. Japanese charting officers analyzed pre-war hydrographic surveys that emphasized the atoll's geographic role as an outpost linking Hawaii to the broader Pacific transport routes. Its capture was expected to shift the American defensive perimeter significantly eastward. From the Japanese perspective, seizing Midway promised a new barrier protecting the empire's central region, reducing the threat of future American raids on the home islands. Amid these calculations, strategic memoranda from the Naval General Staff maintained a steady emphasis on the need for decisive engagement. Reports presented to senior leadership concluded that American naval strength was recovering, yet still insufficient to confront the combined fleet directly. The assessment relied largely on the assumption that American carriers had been damaged or neutralized in earlier engagements. This belief permeated fleet planning conferences, shaping the conviction that a carefully orchestrated operation would draw out and destroy any remaining American carriers while extending Japan's defensive line. Operational preparations reflected these expectations. Carrier divisions practiced coordinated strike launches, while cruiser and destroyer formations rehearsed screening maneuvers designed to counter submarine threats. Radio discipline protocols strengthened in an effort to maintain secrecy. Despite these measures, gaps remained in reconnaissance planning. The fleet relied on long-range flying boats for early detection, yet their coverage area left significant gaps in the approaches from Pearl Harbor. The decision to commit forward submarine picket lines came late, and several positions remained unoccupied at critical moments. Internal records show that staff officers acknowledged these limitations privately, but believed the likelihood of encountering strong American resistance remained low. The atmosphere across the fleet blended confidence with underlying strain. Logbooks from carrier bridge crews recorded routine inspections and briefings that conveyed calm professionalism. Pilots studied maps of Midway's defenses, focusing on fuel storage sites, runways, and hangar positions. Meteorological officers assessed wind patterns to determine optimal approaches for dive bomber and torpedo formations. Every department prepared with methodical precision, yet the broader context continued shifting beyond their knowledge. American code-breaking units had already penetrated operational communications, identifying Midway as the target and setting in motion preparations that contradicted Japanese expectations. None of this was visible from the decks of the First Air Fleet. By late May, the approaching confrontation loomed across the Central Pacific in ways only partly perceived by the Japanese command. The combined fleet planned the operation under the assumption of strategic initiative. The region appeared quiet, and the fleet believed its movements remained concealed. However, the interval between planning and execution created a narrowing margin for error. The calm surface of the Pacific reflected not stability, but a battlefield in slow formation, shaped by incomplete intelligence, logistical wear, operational assumptions, and the determined preparations of an adversary already aware of the coming attack. As the Japanese fleet advanced toward its objective, the Central Pacific's expanse concealed converging forces, each interpreting the operational environment through different sets of assumptions and intelligence. For the Japanese perspective, the moment represented not the beginning of an overconfident gamble, but the continuation of a strategy built on perceived momentum. The conditions surrounding the approach to Midway, weather patterns, reconnaissance gaps, operational strain, and strategic expectations, set the foundation for the battle that would follow. The Pacific remained calm and expansive, yet the stage for a decisive confrontation had already formed across its waters. The planning process that produced Operation MI emerged from the immediate aftermath of Japan's victories in the first months of 1942. The Imperial Japanese Navy held a broad perimeter, stretching from Southeast Asia to the Central Pacific. Yet, internal memoranda circulating within the Naval General Staff emphasized that this expansion did not provide permanent security. Officers within the planning bureaus expressed concern that the American carrier force, though diminished, remained capable of unexpected operations. Reports detailing the Doolittle raid intensified these concerns. The raid demonstrated that the United States could still reach the Japanese home islands, not through a sustained offensive, but through limited symbolic operations that eroded confidence in the defensive perimeter established after early conquests. These assessments created pressure within the high command to seek an operation that would eliminate the remaining American carriers and prevent future surprises. Documents preserved in fleet archives reveal a convergence between strategic necessity and institutional preference. The Imperial Japanese Navy had long favored the concept of a decisive fleet engagement. This doctrine, rooted in pre-war naval theory, envisioned a large-scale clash in which Japan's concentrated forces would destroy the American fleet before it could threaten the Empire's core territories. The early months of the war had not produced such a clash. Instead, Japanese operations focused on rapid territorial expansion, supported by carrier-based strikes. The absence of a decisive engagement left senior commanders searching for an opportunity to bring the American carriers into a controlled battle. Admiral Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, advocated firmly for such an operation. His correspondence and staff notes indicate a strategic mindset formed by an understanding of American industrial capacity and the inevitability of a prolonged conflict. Yamamoto believed that Japan's long-term position would deteriorate unless the American carrier force was neutralized early in the war. The concept of striking Midway Atoll emerged from this broader concern. Midway occupied a transitional zone between the Hawaiian Islands and the open Central Pacific. Capturing it would threaten Hawaii, force the United States to respond, and create an environment in which the combined fleet could position its carrier divisions for a decisive encounter. The Naval General Staff initially resisted elements of Yamamoto's proposal. Their strategic outlook focused on consolidating Japan's southern advances and preparing for potential threats in the Indian Ocean and Australia. Midway appeared peripheral compared to the resource-rich territories Japan had recently seized. Minutes from staff meetings recorded by attending officers indicate that the General Staff viewed Yamamoto's plan as risky. It required dividing the fleet into multiple task groups operating across vast distances. The prospect of overextending naval forces into the Central Pacific raised concerns about coordination, logistics, and the potential vulnerability of escorting units. Despite these reservations, Yamamoto's influence prevailed. His position as Combined Fleet Commander allowed him to shape operational planning directly, and he argued that delay would render later opportunities far less favorable. The Doolittle raid provided further justification by demonstrating that the existing perimeter was insufficient. By April 1942, the General Staff conceded to the plan, and Operation MI, named according to Japanese Naval Code for Midway, entered formal development. The planning process reflected the structural dynamics of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Yamamoto operated from fleet headquarters, not Tokyo, and the separation between the combined fleet and the Naval General Staff contributed to fragmented decision-making. Communications between the two bodies relied on written directives, telegraphic exchanges, and staff liaison officers. This arrangement created gaps in mutual understanding, particularly regarding assumptions about American responses. Planning materials prepared by the General Staff often relied on intelligence estimates that underestimated American readiness. The combined fleet adopted these estimates, incorporating them into operational forecasts that projected limited resistance. Operational charts created during the planning phase illustrate the envisioned structure of the attack. A main carrier force, known as the First Air Fleet, would approach Midway from the northwest and launch initial airstrikes. A separate invasion group would follow behind to land troops and secure the atoll. An additional supporting force, including battleships and cruisers, would operate behind the carriers to reinforce the operation. The plan also included a northern diversionary operation against the Aleutian Islands, intended to draw American forces away from Midway. This multi-layered structure reflected an attempt to force American carriers into a predictable reaction, while maintaining a broad operational footprint across the northern Pacific. Documents outlining the rationale for the Aleutian diversion reveal that planners believed American commanders would respond defensively to threats against their northern frontier. The assumption relied on pre-war assessments that the United States viewed Alaska and the North Pacific as critical defensive zones. Japanese planners expected the American fleet to divide its forces, weakening its capacity to resist the main thrust toward Midway. This expectation remained central to the strategic logic of Operation MI. Within the First Air Fleet, preparations began under the direction of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. His staff received detailed operational orders specifying strike priorities, timing sequences, reconnaissance routes, and refueling schedules. The orders emphasized rapid coordinated air operations intended to overwhelm Midway's defenses before the Americans could mount a counter-response. Reconnaissance doctrine played a significant role in the planning. Long-range flying boats would patrol distant ocean sectors, while carrier aircraft would conduct shorter-range searches. However, the coverage maps reveal multiple gaps, particularly to the east and northeast, directions from which American carriers could approach undetected. These gaps were acknowledged in planning notes, but accepted due to limitations in aircraft range and available reconnaissance assets. The planning process also incorporated assumptions about American morale and readiness. Reports from Japanese naval attachés and intelligence analysts suggested the United States lacked the operational experience required to coordinate multiple carrier groups effectively. These assessments were based on pre-war observations and failed to account for rapid operational learning following early wartime engagements. The Japanese High Command believed American pilots and deck crews would require more time to recover from losses at Coral Sea and other battles. This belief shaped planning decisions, contributing to confidence that the operation would face limited resistance. Logistical considerations formed an additional dimension of the operation. Fuel shipments, ammunition transfers, and equipment inspections required careful sequencing. Fleet tankers were positioned to support the advance toward Midway, while supply ships prepared to accompany the invasion group. Maintenance crews inspected aircraft components and prepared spare parts for deployment. These preparations were extensive, yet constrained by Japan's broader wartime supply situation. Resource shortages, particularly in aviation fuel and replacement aircraft, limited the scale at which the operation could be supported. Staff memoranda reveal concerns that prolonged engagements would strain logistic capacity, reinforcing the intention to conclude the operation quickly. By late May 1942, the structure of Operation MI had solidified into a complex offensive requiring precise timing, cohesive execution, and favorable assumptions. The origins of the plan reflected Japan's strategic doctrine, internal pressures, institutional dynamics, and the perceived need to neutralize American carriers before the balance of power shifted. The operation emerged from a belief in decisive battle, shaped by both historical theory and contemporary urgency. Though the planning appeared coherent within its framework, it rested on intelligence assessments and operational assumptions that would not withstand the conditions ultimately encountered in the Central Pacific. The strategic outlook that shaped Japan's approach to Midway rested on a sequence of assumptions formed during the initial months of the Pacific War. These assumptions had developed gradually through operational success, intelligence estimates, and doctrinal expectations. By early 1942, they had become foundational to the planning process. Yet internal correspondence among naval staff officers, post-war interviews, and contemporary operational summaries showed that several of these assumptions were already under strain. The gap between perceived and actual conditions widened as Operation MI progressed from concept to execution, shaping Japanese expectations in ways that would influence every stage of the coming battle. The first assumption concerned American naval capabilities. Reports circulated through the combined fleet indicated that the U.S. Navy had suffered significant setbacks at Pearl Harbor and in subsequent engagements. These assessments were not inaccurate, but they lacked depth. Japanese planners frequently cited the presumed difficulty the United States faced in repairing damaged battleships, replacing lost aircraft, and retraining carrier air groups. The underlying belief held that American recovery would be slow, incremental, and vulnerable to disruption. However, internal analyses did not fully account for the speed with which the United States mobilized its industrial base and restructured its naval aviation forces. The pace of American carrier crew training and aircraft replacement accelerated more rapidly than Japanese estimates allowed. The assumption of prolonged American weakness created a sense of temporal advantage that influenced the urgency and structure of the Midway operation. A second assumption centered on the condition of the American carrier force. Japanese intelligence estimated that the United States retained 2 operational carriers, with one possibly undergoing repairs. This assessment underestimated American readiness and did not reflect the extent to which U.S. forces had recovered after the Battle of the Coral Sea. The Japanese believed the American fleet would hesitate to engage aggressively without clear numerical superiority. This expectation aligned with pre-war assessments of American naval culture, which portrayed U.S. commanders as cautious and inclined to preserve assets. These interpretations formed part of the strategic rationale behind Yamamoto's plan. By threatening Midway, the operation would compel the remaining American carriers to move forward into a situation the combined fleet could control. A third assumption related to the operational environment of the Central Pacific. Japanese planners believed the vastness of the region would hinder American reconnaissance while aiding the concealment of their own fleet movements. This belief was reflected in reconnaissance coverage maps, showing limited risk of early detection. In practice, however, the Pacific did not serve as a strategic barrier, but as a domain shaped by intelligence capabilities, signals analysis, and long-range patrol aircraft. Japanese staff officers remained unaware that American cryptanalysts had identified Midway as the target through systematic analysis of naval code traffic. No Japanese documentation suggested suspicion that operational details had been compromised. As a result, the combined fleet operated under the assumption of strategic surprise, shaping the confidence with which the plan was executed. A fourth assumption focused on the internal resilience of the Japanese fleet. Operational success in the early months of the war masked cumulative strain on aircraft, pilots, and maintenance crews. Records show repeated requests for spare engines, replacement aircraft, and additional maintenance personnel submitted by carrier division staff officers. While these requests were partially fulfilled, they highlighted underlying concerns about the sustainability of continuous operations. Japanese planners assumed that the First Air Fleet could maintain its performance levels without significant loss of efficiency. The long operational chain from Japan's home islands to the Central Pacific, however, imposed challenges that were underestimated. Fuel deliveries stretched across extended routes, aircraft replacement cycles slowed, and combat fatigue among flight crews grew more pronounced than planning documents acknowledged. A fifth assumption derived from the expectation that the Aleutian diversion would draw American attention northward. Planners believed that the Americans would view any threat to Alaska as indicative of a broader northern strategy, prompting the diversion of carrier forces away from Midway. This belief aligned with intelligence assessments suggesting heightened American concern about northern approaches to the continental United States. However, American planning placed greater emphasis on protecting Hawaii and countering threats to Midway. As a result, the diversion achieved far less strategic effect than anticipated. Japanese confidence in the diversion's success shaped both the scale of forces committed to Midway and predictions about American movements. These assumptions collectively reinforced an expectation of controlled engagement. The Naval General Staff and Combined Fleet shared the belief that American forces would respond predictably and slowly. The assumption that the American carriers were damaged, cautious, or temporarily unavailable encouraged the Japanese command to structure its operation around layered movements and dispersed task groups. Such dispersion reflected confidence in the ability to control the tempo of the confrontation. Modern analyses of operational maps reveal how the fleet's configuration reflected this mindset. Carrier groups moved ahead of support units. The invasion force followed at a significant distance, and reconnaissance responsibilities were divided among multiple assets operating with limited coordination. This strategic outlook shaped expectations for the battle's opening phase. Japanese planners anticipated that American aircraft stationed on Midway would pose a temporary but manageable threat. They believed the initial strike from the 1st Air Fleet would neutralize these defenses, after which further strikes would be unnecessary. The possibility that American carriers might already be at sea, concealed and preparing for engagement, did not appear prominently in operational forecasts. Japanese reconnaissance doctrine focused primarily on confirming expected conditions rather than searching comprehensively for alternative scenarios. This reactive approach reflected underlying assumptions rather than deliberate neglect. Another area where assumptions remained unexamined involved the operational decision-making structure. The combined fleet relied on a centralized command model under Yamamoto, with separate operational discretion delegated to Nagumo aboard the carrier flagship. Internal analyses created after the war revealed that officers recognized the potential difficulty this structure posed, but wartime documents contain no indication that planners anticipated significant confusion or delays. The assumption that communication lines would function reliably across widely dispersed units contributed to confidence in the operational design. However, the distances between task forces exceeded the capacity of available communication systems to provide real-time coordination. As a result, the operational design required conditions of clarity and predictability that the battle would not provide. The final assumption that shaped the origins of Japanese expectations involved perceptions of American morale. Pre-war intelligence assessments described the American public as sensitive to casualties and expected the United States to avoid high-risk naval confrontations. These assessments influenced the belief that American commanders would avoid battle unless they possessed a clear numerical advantage. This assumption contributed to the expectation that the Midway operation would draw the American fleet only after Japanese forces had seized the initiative. The possibility that American commanders might seek engagement aggressively was not reflected in Japanese estimates. Collectively, these assumptions formed a coherent strategic framework in which the Midway operation appeared feasible and timely. The assumptions were not arbitrary. They arose from pre-war doctrine, early wartime experience, and available intelligence. Yet, by the time Operation MI entered its final planning stages, several of these assumptions no longer reflected the conditions of the Central Pacific. The Japanese High Command observed the situation through a lens shaped by early victories, limited intelligence, and institutional doctrine. As a result, the operation advanced toward execution under a set of expectations that would be severely tested once the battle began. The strain on these assumptions did not produce immediate alarm within the Japanese command structure, but they shaped the operational framework in ways that left little margin for adaptation. Operational intelligence formed one of the most significant structural weaknesses in Japan's approach to Midway. Although the Imperial Japanese Navy maintained a sophisticated reconnaissance system for its time, the limitations of its intelligence apparatus, combined with systematic over-reliance on partially verified assumptions, created gaps that shaped every stage of the operation. Documents from fleet archives, staff memoranda, pilot debriefs, and post-war interrogations illustrate a pattern of incomplete awareness regarding American capabilities, dispositions, and preparations. These gaps were not the result of carelessness, but of structural constraints within Japan's intelligence network and the inherent difficulty of collecting reliable information across the vast Pacific. One of the central blind spots involved signals intelligence. Japan's cryptographic confidence had grown following early war successes in breaking several Allied codes, particularly those used by British and Dutch forces in Southeast Asia. This created a sense of security in the integrity of Japanese communications. Staff officers believed their cipher systems remained impenetrable, supported by intercept summaries that revealed no evidence of American decoding efforts. As a result, planning for Operation MI assumed that operational secrecy was intact. The combined fleet transmitted detailed movement schedules, flight plans, and deployment orders across channels believed secure. None of the Japanese records indicate suspicion that American cryptanalysts had successfully penetrated the Navy's primary operational code. The absence of such awareness allowed the United States to prepare for the Midway offensive with precision that the Japanese intelligence apparatus could not detect. Human intelligence also presented weaknesses. Japanese naval attachés based in the United States had been withdrawn following the outbreak of war, and their previous reports lacked insight into U.S. wartime mobilization. Attempts to gather information through neutral intermediaries yielded limited detail. By contrast, American intelligence benefited from access to broader diplomatic networks and information-sharing arrangements. Japanese intelligence officers continued to rely heavily on pre-war assessments that no longer aligned with the rapidly shifting industrial and military landscape of 1942. Internal intelligence briefs circulated within the General Staff continued to repeat estimates about American aircraft production cycles and ship repair timelines that were increasingly inaccurate. Operational reconnaissance posed a second major blind spot. The vast distances of the Central Pacific created inherent challenges that even Japan's long-range flying boats could not fully overcome. Reconnaissance routes outlined in planning documents for Operation MI assigned Kawanishi H-8K flying boats to distant patrols intended to detect American forces before they approached Midway. These missions relied on a chain of refueling stations and rendezvous procedures that were vulnerable to weather disruptions. Operational logs showed that several planned long-range reconnaissance flights were delayed or canceled due to cloud cover or logistical complications, reducing the overall coverage area. Carrier-based reconnaissance also faced limitations. The 1st Air Fleet assigned a small number of float planes and carrier aircraft to conduct daily searches during the approach to Midway. But these missions lacked the range necessary to cover all potential avenues of American approach. The search plans focused heavily on confirming the absence of threats rather than exploring unexpected areas. The pattern reflected underlying assumptions. Japanese planners expected American forces to be positioned farther east, and therefore regarded certain search sectors as low priority. Inspection of search route logs reveals that several critical sectors were either lightly covered or not patrolled at all in the days leading up to the battle. A third area of intelligence shortfall concerned the operational state of Midway itself. Pre-war aerial photographs provided by Japanese reconnaissance flights had captured the atoll's infrastructure, but these images were outdated by mid-1942. American forces had significantly expanded Midway's defensive capabilities in response to early Pacific campaigns. Additional anti-aircraft batteries, radar installations, torpedo storage facilities, and aircraft dispersal areas had been constructed. Japanese planning documents did not reflect these updates. Intelligence officers estimated that Midway's air strength remained modest, consisting primarily of patrol aircraft and a limited number of fighters. The scale and preparedness of Midway's defensive network were therefore underestimated in operational forecasts. The most consequential blind spot, however, concerned American carrier movements. Japanese command believed the American carriers would not leave Pearl Harbor until the Japanese offensive had already commenced. This belief rested on multiple intelligence assessments, including visual sightings from submarines positioned near Hawaii. Yet the submarine picket line intended to monitor American departures was incomplete. Several submarines arrived late to their assigned patrol areas due to weather and navigational delays. Operational communications indicate that the submarine line was not fully established when American carriers departed. Reports from the few submarines in position failed to detect the outbound American task groups. This gap left Japanese planners unaware that American carriers were already at sea and preparing to engage. Internal operational analyses show that Japanese intelligence officers relied almost exclusively on negative evidence. The absence of sightings was taken as confirmation that American carriers remained in port. The possibility that the American fleet had evaded detection was not treated as a significant risk. This approach aligned with the broader intelligence culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy, which prioritized verification of expected conditions over identification of unexpected developments. As a result, the complete absence of sightings reinforced the original assumption rather than prompting reconsideration. Another blind spot surfaced in the interpretation of American strategic intent. Japanese intelligence analysts believed that American priorities centered on defending Hawaii and safeguarding supply routes to Australia. This assessment had validity, but it underestimated the rapid shift in American risk calculus following early confrontations. The U.S. Navy's willingness to commit its carriers to counter Japanese movements at Coral Sea contradicted assumptions of defensive conservatism. Yet, Japanese intelligence briefs did not reassess their conclusions based on this evidence. Reports circulated before Operation MI continued to state that American carrier groups were unlikely to engage unless they possessed clear numerical advantage. This belief influenced Japanese planning and contributed to the expectation that the carriers would not appear early in the battle. Weather forecasting formed another component of the intelligence landscape. Meteorological data gathered by Japanese reconnaissance aircraft indicated that cloud cover and visibility conditions around Midway would vary significantly during early June. Yet forecasting limitations prevented accurate predictions of how these conditions might affect American or Japanese movements. Fleet records show concerns about visibility hindering morning flight operations, but planners still expected reconnaissance aircraft to function effectively. Japanese forecasts did not anticipate the specific weather patterns that later hindered their search efforts. This environmental unpredictability compounded pre-existing intelligence gaps. Combined Fleet Headquarters also lacked clear insight into American radar capabilities. While Japanese planners were aware that radar existed, they underestimated its effectiveness in detecting incoming aircraft and coordinating defensive responses. Pre-war intelligence reports had provided incomplete descriptions of American radar systems, and wartime operations did not produce enough direct encounters to revise these assessments. As a result, Japanese planners believed their early morning airstrike against Midway would achieve surprise, while in reality, American radar installations detected the strike well in advance, enabling defensive preparations that significantly reduced the effectiveness of the initial attack. Finally, internal communication patterns contributed to intelligence blind spots. The separation between the Naval General Staff in Tokyo and the combined fleet at sea created delays in the transmission of updates and interpretations. Staff officers aboard the flagship received intelligence summaries that reflected analyses originating from distant headquarters. These summaries often lacked context or omitted earlier revisions. The result was a fragmented intelligence picture that appeared coherent on paper, but contained inherent contradictions. Planners aboard mobile command ships operated with incomplete situational awareness, while the general staff relied on outdated operational assumptions. Together, these blind spots created an intelligence environment in which Japanese planners viewed the upcoming operation through a narrow field of understanding. The intelligence apparatus possessed capable personnel, established procedures, and operational experience, yet it functioned under constraints that limited its effectiveness. The combined fleet entered the waters near Midway, believing its movements were concealed, its reconnaissance sufficient, and its assumptions sound. In reality, the intelligence picture was incomplete, shaped by limitations in data, unreliable forecasts, and misinterpretations of American resolve. These factors formed the informational foundation upon which Operation MI would proceed, shaping decisions whose consequences became evident only once the battle began. The final weeks before the Midway operation marked a period in which the Imperial Japanese Navy moved from conceptual planning to irreversible commitment. Operational timetables compressed, logistics networks strained, and the movement of fleet units created a sense of momentum that limited opportunities for revision. Documents from the combined fleet, including movement orders, fuel requisitions, and air group readiness reports, convey how the decision to execute Operation MI solidified into a sequence of actions that could not easily be reversed. The acceleration toward Midway unfolded through coordinated fleet movements, logistical deployments, and command decisions that locked Japan into the operation's trajectory. The departure of major fleet units from home waters initiated the transition from planning to execution. Carrier Divisions 1 and 2, centered around Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, left the inland sea in late May, accompanied by their escorts. Movement orders specified strict radio silence, precise navigational routes, and scheduled refueling operations. The carriers advanced into the northern Pacific along a route chosen to minimize detection by American reconnaissance. Log entries from escort destroyers detail routine engine inspections, refueling drills, and constant monitoring of weather conditions as the fleet proceeded through cooler northern waters before turning south toward the Central Pacific. These early movements reflected the combined fleet's emphasis on maintaining operational secrecy and controlling the timing of the approach. As the carriers advanced, the Aleutian force departed on a separate trajectory. This northern diversionary operation, part of Operation AL, moved toward the Aleutian Islands to draw American forces away from Midway. The scale of this diversion was significant, involving cruisers, destroyers, and landing forces. Its separation from the main fleet reflected a broader operational design that dispersed Japanese naval power across vast distances. Planning documents show the combined fleet expected the diversion to shape American movements decisively, creating conditions favorable for the main carrier force. The strategic logic of splitting forces appeared sound within the Japanese framework, yet it imposed constraints on mutual support that became increasingly evident as the operation progressed. In parallel, the invasion force assigned to land troops on Midway departed from Japan's central logistical hubs. This formation included transports, supply ships, and escort vessels. Operational orders placed the invasion force at a considerable distance behind the carriers, reflecting the expectation that Midway's defenses would be neutralized before landing. Internal memoranda emphasized the need for rapid consolidation once the atoll was secured. Engineering units prepared equipment for runway repairs, communication installations, and defensive fortifications. While fragmented across multiple task groups, the overall operation followed a rigid timetable that assumed minimal interference. Fleet tankers played a central role in the acceleration toward Midway. Their movements, documented in refueling logs and navigational reports, revealed the extensive logistical effort required to sustain the carrier groups. Tankers positioned themselves at predetermined rendezvous points to refuel the fleet en route. These operations involved precise coordination, as refueling at sea required steady weather conditions, reduced speed, and predictable positioning. The necessity of maintaining this refueling schedule narrowed the fleet's operational flexibility. Deviations from the timetable risked leaving frontline units without sufficient fuel reserves to maneuver effectively. The dependency on tanker support contributed to the sense of forward momentum, as any delay would disrupt the entire operational sequence. Aircraft preparation intensified as the fleet advanced. Maintenance crews worked continuously to ensure aircraft readiness. Records from maintenance logs outline systematic inspections of engines, airframes, fuel lines, and ordnance systems. The wear accumulated during previous campaigns required careful attention, but the compressed timetable limited opportunities for thorough overhaul. As the carriers approached Midway, pilots conducted final checks on navigation charts, attack plans, and fuel calculations. These preparations reflected the assumption that the initial strike would determine the course of the battle. The operational sequence depended on swift neutralization of Midway's defenses and rapid transition to secondary strikes or reconnaissance. Weather reports issued from fleet meteorological units shaped operational expectations, but did not alter the overall timetable. Forecasts indicated variable cloud cover and shifting wind patterns around Midway in early June. These conditions posed challenges for flight operations, but were not considered significant enough to modify the plan. The fleet continued its approach despite concerns about visibility and potential disruptions to early morning air operations. These assessments underscored the belief that conditions, while imperfect, remained manageable. As the fleet closed in on Midway, reconnaissance responsibilities expanded. Carrier-based aircraft conducted regular patrols along predetermined routes, searching for signs of American forces. These patrols consumed flight time, fuel, and pilot endurance, yet their coverage remained limited by range and weather. Operational logs indicate that search patterns remained largely unchanged despite rising uncertainty. Planners maintained confidence that American forces remained unaware of the Japanese approach. This confidence persisted even as minor inconsistencies appeared in reconnaissance reports. Search aircraft failed to sight expected American shipping routes or routine patrol aircraft. Yet this absence did not prompt re-evaluation. Instead, negative sightings reinforced existing assumptions, creating a feedback loop that favored operational momentum over cautious reassessment. Communication between fleet units and the combined fleet headquarters emphasized maintaining schedule adherence. Written directives issued from Yamamoto's command ship outlined the timing of the initial strike, the expected pattern of air operations, and the sequencing of fleet movements. These orders reflected a centralized approach to command that relied on coherence between dispersed task groups. The complexity of the plan required each unit to follow its assigned timeline precisely. Deviations risked creating gaps in reconnaissance coverage, disrupting strike coordination, or misaligning support operations. This structural dependency on coordinated timing reinforced the commitment to proceed as planned, narrowing the window for operational flexibility. The acceleration toward Midway also highlighted institutional dynamics within the Japanese command structure. While the Naval General Staff in Tokyo had expressed reservations about aspects of the plan, their role diminished once fleet units departed. Operational control passed fully to Yamamoto and his staff, who managed the unfolding operation from their forward command post. This shift in control reduced opportunities for high-level reevaluation. The separation between the combined fleet and Tokyo, already significant during planning, became complete during execution. Decisions depended on the situational awareness available at sea, which remained limited by incomplete reconnaissance and communication delays. By early June, the convergence of fleet movements, logistics, reconnaissance, and command decisions placed the Japanese Navy in a position from which withdrawal or substantial revision was impractical. Each component of the operation relied on the others. The diversion in the Aleutians continued. The invasion force advanced along its route. The carrier groups approached their launch point. Tankers maintained scheduled refueling operations. The operation's scale and design created momentum that carried the fleet toward Midway, regardless of emerging uncertainties. The acceleration toward the objective reflected both strategic intent and operational inflexibility. This combination of logistical commitment, doctrinal confidence, and institutional momentum shaped the transition into the battle. As the First Air Fleet prepared to launch its opening strike, the operation had reached a point where the assumptions, intelligence assessments, and planning decisions of previous weeks would begin to interact with the realities of combat. The structure of the operation, once set in motion, advanced with a sense of inevitability shaped by the choices made during planning and the constraints imposed by the Pacific itself. The fleet approached Midway prepared for a coordinated offensive built on expectations that would soon encounter conditions far more complex than anticipated. The composition of the forces committed to Operation MI reveals the scale and ambition of the Japanese plan. The Imperial Japanese Navy assembled a multi-layered formation that reflected both doctrinal preferences and operational constraints. This structure placed the most experienced carrier divisions at the center of the offensive while dispersing supporting units across wide distances. Archival fleet rosters, post-war operational charts, and readiness reports illustrate the detailed arrangement of these forces and the responsibilities assigned to each component. The organization of the fleet reflected an effort to project overwhelming strength at the decisive point, yet it also exposed structural vulnerabilities that influenced the battle's outcome. At the core of the operation stood the 1st Air Fleet, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. This formation consisted primarily of 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, organized into 2 carrier divisions. Each carrier housed an experienced air group composed of dive bombers, torpedo aircraft, and fighters. The aircraft types included the Aichi D-3A dive bomber, the Nakajima B-5N torpedo bomber, and the Mitsubishi A-6M fighter. These aircraft had proven effective in earlier operations, and their crews represented some of the most seasoned aviators in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Training records indicate that many pilots had gained extensive experience during campaigns in the South Pacific and Indian Ocean. However, this experience came with accumulated fatigue, and replacement pilots were fewer than the fleet's needs demanded. The air groups remained competent, but prolonged operations had reduced the overall margin for error. The 1st Air Fleet was supported by an extensive screening force designed to protect the carriers from submarine and surface threats. This screen consisted of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers arranged in concentric defensive formations. The battleships Haruna and Kirishima operated as part of the initial screen, providing long-range artillery support if needed. Heavy cruisers, including the Tone and Chikuma, were equipped with reconnaissance floatplanes to extend the fleet's scouting range. Destroyers formed the innermost layer of the screen, responsible for anti-submarine patrols and immediate defensive action. Patrol reports from these vessels during the approach to Midway record continuous monitoring of sonar contacts, surface movements, and weather conditions. Despite these measures, the vastness of the Pacific created significant gaps in detection capability. Behind Nagumo's carriers advanced the main body of the combined fleet under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. This force included the flagship battleship Yamato, then the largest and most heavily armed warship in the world, along with additional battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. The presence of Yamamoto's main body reflected the doctrinal expectation of a decisive fleet engagement. In the event that American carriers were drawn into battle, the main body would advance to deliver a conclusive blow with its heavy guns. However, the distance between the main body and the 1st Air Fleet placed Yamamoto's forces too far to influence the early stages of the battle. Movement logs show that the main body remained hundreds of miles behind Nagumo's carriers, limiting its ability to provide timely support. To the north, the Aleutian Force mobilized under Operation AL. This formation consisted of light carriers, cruisers, and destroyers designated to strike American positions in the Aleutian Islands. Their objective was to create a northern threat that would draw American attention away from Midway. The separation of this force from the main operation illustrated the dispersion inherent in Japan's strategic design. While intended to support the overall plan indirectly, this diversion removed resources that might otherwise have strengthened Nagumo's carrier forces. The Aleutian operation remained entirely separate in both timing and coordination from the activities near Midway. The invasion force assigned to occupy Midway constituted another major component of the operation. This force included troop transports, supply vessels, engineering units, and escorting warships. Their role depended entirely on the success of Nagumo's air offensive. Operational orders instructed the invasion force to advance only after Midway's defenses had been neutralized. The invasion units carried equipment for constructing anti-aircraft positions, repairing airfields, and establishing a Japanese administrative presence on the atoll. Engineering logs outlined planned repairs to runways and the installation of communication facilities intended to integrate Midway into Japan's Central Pacific Defense Line. The invasion force operated at a considerable distance behind the carriers to avoid premature engagement with American forces. Long-range reconnaissance played a significant role in the mobilization of forces for Operation MI. Flying boats assigned to distant patrols operated from bases in the Marshall Islands, supported by refueling craft positioned along their routes. These aircraft were equipped to search broad ocean sectors, but faced limitations in range and weather tolerance. Their operational readiness reports indicate the challenges posed by storms, wind, and cloud cover in the northern Pacific. Carrier-based scout planes provided additional reconnaissance capacity, but remain limited by flight endurance and the need to preserve aircraft for upcoming strike operations. The reconnaissance units were capable, but could not fully compensate for the inherent difficulty of monitoring the expansive waters around Midway. Logistical forces supported the operational advance. Fleet tankers carried fuel reserves essential for sustaining the high-speed movements of the First Air Fleet. These tankers operated under strict time schedules, coordinating rendezvous points at sea where carriers and escorts could replenish their fuel stores. Supply ships carried aviation ordnance, spare parts, food, and medical supplies. Movement orders indicate that the fleet maintained a tight logistical sequence, as delays in refueling or resupply would disrupt the timing of the entire operation. The reliance on tanker support highlighted the operational strain imposed by the Pacific's vast distances. Aircraft readiness depended on the delivery of ordnance and maintenance equipment, further constraining the flexibility of the carrier forces. Air group organization reflected the tactical demands of the operation. Dive bomber units prepared for attacks against Midway's defensive structures, targeting runways, hangars, and anti-aircraft positions. Torpedo bomber units were assigned to attack American naval vessels, with training focused on coordinated strikes designed to overwhelm defensive measures. Fighter units prepared for both escort missions and defensive combat against any American aircraft encountered. Internal briefings addressed pilot fatigue, maintenance limitations, and expected opposition. While confident in their capabilities, air group leaders expressed concerns about the tempo of operations required to sustain the offensive across consecutive strike waves. These concerns underscored the operational pressures placed on the fleet's limited number of experienced air crews. Each component of the Japanese force carried distinct responsibilities within the overall plan. The First Air Fleet would neutralize Midway's defenses and engage American carriers if they appeared. The main body would deliver the final blow in a decisive surface engagement. The invasion force would secure the atoll. The Aleutian force would divert American attention. Reconnaissance units would detect enemy movements in time to allow Nagumo to position his carriers advantageously. Logistical units would sustain the fleet across vast distances. The plan relied on cohesive coordination among these dispersed elements, each dependent on the others and on the assumptions that underpin the operation. The mobilization of Japan's forces for the Midway operation displayed the strengths and limitations of the Imperial Japanese Navy at the height of its power. The fleet possessed advanced carriers, well-trained aviators, powerful battleships, and capable support units. Its commanders had operational experience and doctrinal clarity. Yet the distribution of forces across distant operational zones, the logistical strains of long-range operations, and the limited capacity for rapid adaptation created a structure vulnerable to unforeseen developments. The forces mobilized for the offensive represented a formidable concentration of naval power, but one whose cohesion depended on conditions that would not hold once the battle commenced. The morning of 4th June 1942 marked the point at which the structural assumptions that shaped Operation MI encountered conditions that negated the coherence of Japanese planning. From the Japanese command perspective aboard Nagumo's flagship Akagi, the first hours of the battle followed the expected pattern. Reconnaissance searches launched, aircraft prepared for the initial strike against Midway, and the fleet positioned to deliver coordinated attacks. Yet within this appearance of orderly execution lay a sequence of misaligned events, delayed reports, and operational pressures that converged into a moment of strategic reversal. Logs, radio transcripts, and post-war interviews with surviving officers reveal how these overlapping pressures influenced the decisions made during the crucial interval between sunrise and the loss of Japanese carrier superiority. The initial attack on Midway commenced shortly after dawn. Dive bombers and fighters from the First Air Fleet launched according to the established plan, crossing the expanse between the carriers and the atoll under the expectation that surprise would favor their assault. However, American radar installations on Midway detected the incoming strike early, allowing defenders to position fighters and prepare anti-aircraft batteries. The Japanese attack inflicted damage on installations and facilities, but did not achieve the level of neutralization expected in the operational plan. Reports transmitted from the returning strike leaders indicated that a second attack was necessary to suppress remaining defensive capacities. These assessments placed immediate pressure on Nagumo's staff to prepare another strike wave. Simultaneously, reconnaissance efforts that morning encountered complications. The float planes launched from Tone and Chikuma began their standard search patterns, intended to detect American carrier forces approaching from the east. Due to delays in launching one of the float planes, a portion of the search area remained unexamined during the critical early minutes of the operation. Weather conditions and cloud cover further reduced visibility across certain sectors, hindering comprehensive reconnaissance coverage. The system of reconnaissance utilized by the 1st Air Fleet relied heavily on the assumption that early detection would allow sufficient time for Nagumo to position his forces against American carriers. The delays and coverage gaps meant that American movements remained undetected at the moment when Japanese forces required clarity most urgently. The absence of immediate sightings reinforced the belief among Nagumo's staff that American carriers remained distant. This assumption shaped the initial decision to maintain the reserve strike force aboard the carriers armed with torpedoes, intended for use against naval targets. However, as reports from the Midway strike indicated the need for a second attack, Nagumo faced a doctrinally complex choice: whether to reserve the torpedo-armed aircraft for potential engagement with American naval forces, or to rearm them with bombs for a second strike on the atoll. Rearming required significant time, particularly due to the need to shift ordnance across crowded hangar decks and conduct safety procedures to prevent accidents. The process also constrained deck operations by occupying personnel and delaying potential responses to new developments. Nagumo initially adhered to the plan's assumptions, preserving the torpedo-armed aircraft in anticipation of a naval engagement. At 07:28, the situation shifted abruptly. A delayed reconnaissance report from one of the Tone float planes indicated the presence of 10 ships east of the Japanese carriers. The vagueness of the report created uncertainty. The identity of the ships remained unclear, and the lack of immediate clarification hindered Nagumo's ability to respond decisively. Staff officers requested additional details, but the reconnaissance aircraft required time to close distance and confirm the sighting. The key question, whether the sighted ships included American carriers, remained unanswered during a crucial interval. Within the Japanese command structure, decisions depended on precise identification of enemy forces, and without confirmation, Nagumo hesitated to commit to irreversible actions. Minutes later, as the float plane transmitted additional information suggesting the presence of a carrier, the operational landscape underwent a decisive shift. The presence of American carriers within strike range contradicted operational expectations and placed Nagumo in a position where both doctrinal principles and tactical realities created conflicting pressures. The reserve strike force remained in the process of being rearmed for a second strike on Midway. To engage the American carriers effectively, these aircraft required torpedoes, not bombs. However, reloading the torpedoes required extensive time and exposed aircraft and personnel to heightened risk on crowded hangar decks. The fleet's ability to launch a coordinated strike depended on the state of the aircraft, their ordnance, and the operational readiness of deck crews. The need to return the Midway strike force further complicated matters, as flight decks needed to be cleared for landing operations before new aircraft could be positioned for launch. The delay produced by this combination of factors gave the American carriers the opportunity to strike first. As the Japanese fleet worked to resolve conflicting operational priorities, the first American attacks approached. Torpedo squadrons from the American carriers launched early and in piecemeal fashion, following different approaches due to the need to adapt to weather conditions and coordinate with limited information. Although these early attacks inflicted no damage and cost the Americans significant losses, they compelled Japanese fighters to descend and engage at low altitude, disrupting the combat air patrol structure. Meanwhile, dive bombers from American carrier groups approached undetected at higher altitude. The Japanese fighters, engaged at lower levels, were unable to respond effectively when the dive bombers commenced their attack. The carriers Keiga, Akagi, and Soryu were struck within minutes by coordinated attacks that targeted their flight decks, hangar bays, and fuel lines. The presence of partially rearmed aircraft and exposed ordnance aboard the carriers amplified the damage. Explosions spread rapidly through enclosed spaces, disabling critical systems and preventing recovery. From the Japanese perspective, the sudden destruction of 3 carriers represented a collapse of the operational structure underlying Operation MI. The plan depended on the coordinated carrier air power to neutralize Midway, engage American naval forces, and support the invasion. The loss of the carriers within minutes removed the fleet's ability to project air power and rendered the remaining forces vulnerable. Hiryu, the 4th carrier, remained operational and launched counterstrikes in an attempt to re-establish parity, successfully damaging the American carrier Yorktown. However, reconnaissance reports indicated the continued presence of American forces, and Hiryu's limited air group could not sustain prolonged engagement. Subsequent American strikes located and disabled Hiryu as well. The destruction of the 1st Air Fleet's carrier strength marked the strategic reversal at the heart of the Midway operation. The loss extended beyond the physical damage to the carriers themselves. Operational documents indicate significant losses among experienced pilots and flight deck personnel, whose expertise represented a critical component of Japanese naval aviation. Replacement cycles could not compensate for the scale of loss. The collapse of the 1st Air Fleet's air power rendered the invasion force untenable, and the diversionary operation in the Aleutians lost its intended purpose. The Japanese command structure faced the rapid realization that the assumptions guiding their planning had been invalidated. The expected absence of American carriers, the belief in operational secrecy, and the confidence in controlled tempo all fell away in the span of hours. The operational design, built on dispersed forces, rigid timelines, and precise coordination, contained no contingencies for such a scenario. Admiral Yamamoto's main body remained too distant to influence the engagement, unable to deliver the decisive surface confrontation envisioned in the plan. The fleet withdrew under the necessity of preserving remaining assets, leaving the strategic initiative to the Americans. The moment of reversal at Midway reflected not merely the outcome of a single attack sequence, but the culmination of structural weaknesses embedded in the Japanese approach. The combination of reconnaissance delays, doctrinal rigidity, logistical constraints, and operational complexity created a scenario in which the Japanese carriers were exposed at the precise moment the Americans achieved tactical advantage. The reversal did not occur gradually. It emerged abruptly from the intersection of planning assumptions and battlefield realities. The destruction of the carriers on the 4th of June represented a turning point, not only in the battle, but in Japan's broader strategic trajectory in the Pacific. The hours following the loss of 3 carriers transformed the operational landscape for the remaining Japanese forces. What had begun as a structured offensive designed around coordinated strike sequences, layered reconnaissance, and predictable responses became a fragmented effort to re-establish situational awareness and preserve remaining assets. Japanese command documents, signal logs, and post-war recollections illustrate how the operational complexity expanded rapidly once the 1st Air Fleet's cohesion collapsed. The forces engaged in the Midway operation now confronted a series of simultaneous challenges: disrupted communication networks, incomplete reconnaissance, logistical instability, and mounting uncertainty regarding American intentions. This convergence of factors created an increasingly intricate environment in which coherent decision-making became difficult to sustain. Hiryu, the sole surviving operational carrier, represented the last component of Nagumo's striking power. Her air group, though limited, retained enough strength to launch counterattacks capable of inflicting damage. The immediate problem facing Hiryu's command staff was the need to identify the precise location, composition, and readiness of the American carrier forces. The previous reconnaissance gaps had not been fully resolved, and the sudden destruction of 3 carriers eliminated the network of scout aircraft that had supported the 1st Air Fleet's search patterns. Hiryu's remaining reconnaissance assets launched urgently, but cloud cover, distance, and the pace of the battle restricted their ability to produce timely, accurate reports. The need for reconnaissance clashed with the need for offensive action. Each aircraft assigned to search reduced the number available for strikes, and repositioning the carrier group to support scouting operations risked exposure to additional American attacks. Faced with incomplete information, Hiryu's leadership prioritized rapid retaliation. The first counterstrike located and damaged Yorktown, providing a temporary sense of tactical achievement. However, the attack did not eliminate the American carrier threat. Damage control aboard Yorktown allowed her to recover functionality long enough to launch additional aircraft, while the other American carriers retained their full operational capabilities. The limited scale of Hiryu's counterstrikes underscored how the First Air Fleet's initial losses constrained the strategic impact of Japanese responses. Simultaneously, the broader Japanese fleet confronted rising uncertainty. Communication with Nagumo's flagship deteriorated due to the rapid destruction of Akagi and the chaotic circumstances aboard damaged vessels. Staff officers aboard surviving cruisers and destroyers attempted to reconstruct the situation from fragmented signals and limited visual observations. Log entries from support vessels reflect confusion regarding the state of the carrier force, the identification of enemy units, and the status of the invasion plan. Without centralized coordination, individual commanders operated with incomplete situational awareness, often relying on outdated assumptions. The main body of the combined fleet, positioned far to the west under Admiral Yamamoto, attempted to gather information as the situation updated irregularly. Signal logs indicate repeated attempts to determine the exact condition of the carrier force and the location of American vessels. These inquiries reflected uncertainty at the highest levels of command. The dispersion of the fleet had been a foundational element of the operational plan, designed to draw American forces into disadvantageous positions. After the loss of 3 carriers, however, dispersion became a liability. The main body's distance prevented immediate intervention, and the carrier's destruction occurred before Yamamoto could reposition his forces. Operational complexity also increased due to the need to balance offensive and defensive priorities. Hiryu's leadership faced the dual challenge of protecting the carrier from American attacks while launching counterstrikes. Defensive operations required maintaining combat air patrols, coordinating fighter coverage, and preserving maneuvering room to evade incoming threats. Offense required deck availability, ordnance preparation, and clear identification of enemy positions. The simultaneous execution of these tasks under pressure strained available personnel and resources. Deck crews operated amid heightened risk, managing ordnance and preparing aircraft without the redundancy normally provided by multiple carriers. The invasion force experienced growing uncertainty as well. Positioned far behind the carrier groups, it depended on the First Air Fleet to neutralize Midway's defenses and secure air superiority. Reports of carrier losses created immediate concern regarding the viability of the landing operation. Planning documents emphasized that the invasion could not proceed without overwhelming control of the skies. With Japanese carrier strength collapsing, the invasion force faced the likelihood of encountering stiff resistance without adequate support. Communications between the invasion group and the combined fleet revealed rising doubts about the operation's feasibility. Environmental conditions continued to complicate matters. Cloud cover and variable winds hindered reconnaissance efforts and obscured American movements. The unpredictability of visibility prevented Japanese forces from establishing a reliable operational picture. The complexity of the situation increased as American aircraft approached in multiple waves from different directions, complicating detection and interception. Logs from Japanese destroyers describe difficulty in tracking incoming formations, as radar was not available to supplement visual identification. These limitations made defensive operations increasingly reactive. As Hiryu launched further counterattacks, the risk of exposure grew. Reconnaissance reports suggested additional American aircraft were inbound, prompting evasive maneuvers that disrupted flight operations. The need to recover returning aircraft conflicted with the requirement to maneuver defensively. Each decision involved trade-offs that reduced Japanese operational flexibility. Post-war analyses highlight how the combination of deck congestion, limited fighter availability, and incomplete reconnaissance shaped a scenario in which Hiryu could not effectively coordinate sustained air operations. The situation reached a new level of complexity when American dive bombers located Hiryu during the late afternoon. The Japanese carrier's attempt to evade the attack was constrained by the need to maintain flight operations. The dive bombers struck Hiryu with precision, similar to the attacks that had destroyed the earlier carriers. The resulting fires spread across her flight deck and hangar spaces, eliminating the last Japanese carrier capable of offensive action. With Hiryu disabled, the remaining Japanese forces lost their capacity to contest American air superiority. The destruction of Hiryu deepened the operational complexity for the Japanese fleet. Without carrier air groups, reconnaissance became reliant on float planes with limited range and vulnerability to American fighters. Defensive capabilities diminished, creating increased pressure on surface forces already dispersed across vast distances. The fleet now faced the challenge of withdrawing damaged units while preserving the integrity of remaining formations. Signals between fleet units reflected an urgent need to regroup and reassess, yet the scale of the losses complicated coordination. In the hours following Hiryu's destruction, the combined fleet confronted rising operational instability. The invasion of Midway was no longer feasible. The Aleutian diversion lost strategic relevance. The main body lacked the air cover required for surface engagement. Reconnaissance remained insufficient for identifying American positions with precision. Each component of the original plan now operated under conditions markedly different from those envisioned during planning. The fleet began to disengage, but the process required coordination across dispersed units, each navigating through uncertainty. The complexity that emerged during the battle was not the product of a single failure, but the cumulative effect of interdependent systems confronted with unforeseen contingencies. The Japanese forces entered the Midway operation with a structure that relied on coherence, timing, and control. Once these elements faltered, the operational environment grew increasingly complex. As the battle progressed, Japanese commanders faced conditions for which the original plan provided no practical solutions. The fragmentation of reconnaissance, the collapse of carrier strength, and the dispersion of fleet units created a scenario in which coordinated action became impossible. The rising operational complexity became self-reinforcing, shaping the path toward withdrawal and marking a significant transformation in Japan's strategic position in the Pacific. The Japanese defeat at Midway produced an extensive body of interpretation, both during the war and in the decades that followed. Within the Japanese Navy, early assessments focused on operational errors and misfortune, shaped by the immediate need to explain the loss of 4 carriers and the abrupt halt to Japan's strategic momentum. Later analyses, conducted by historians, naval officers, and military scholars, expanded the interpretive landscape, examining the battle through doctrinal, organizational, and strategic perspectives. These interpretations vary in emphasis but collectively illuminate the structural, technological, and conceptual factors that contributed to the outcome. By tracing these perspectives, the Japanese experience at Midway emerges not as an isolated failure, but as a convergence of systemic vulnerabilities and evolving adversary capabilities. The earliest interpretations emerged from internal Japanese inquiries conducted shortly after the battle. These examinations, preserved in wartime memoranda and later reconstructed through surviving officers' recollections, emphasize the role of unforeseen circumstances. The most immediate narrative attributed the defeat to the unexpected arrival of American carriers and the coincidental timing of the American dive bomber attacks. Reports described the sequence of events as a combination of reconnaissance delays, weather disruptions, and misaligned operational timing. This view framed the disaster as a product of unfavorable conditions rather than flaws in the operation's design. Such explanations reflected the institutional need to preserve the doctrinal integrity of the fleet and prevent the erosion of confidence within the officer corps. A second interpretive strand emerged during late wartime planning discussions, where senior officers acknowledged the rigidity of the operational plan. These analyses noted that the dispersion of forces across vast distances constrained the fleet's capacity to respond to unexpected developments. The separation of the Aleutian diversion, the invasion force, and the main carrier strike group created a structure that could not easily adapt when the tactical situation shifted. The plan had depended on American predictability and on the fleet's ability to maintain initiative. Once American actions diverged from Japanese expectations, the structure of Operation MI limited opportunities for rapid adjustment. This interpretation placed emphasis on the inherent complexity of the plan rather than on the performance of individual commanders. Post-war Japanese officers, particularly those involved in planning, offered a more detailed examination of the assumptions underlying the operation. Their memoirs and technical accounts describe a doctrinal environment shaped by the concept of decisive battle and by pre-war expectations about how naval power should be employed. Several officers argued that the decisive battle doctrine remained sound, but was misapplied in the context of carrier warfare. They noted that the doctrinal framework had been designed for surface engagements, not for fast-moving battles driven by aviation. The rigid expectation that American forces would respond predictably reflected this doctrinal lens. From this perspective, the failure at Midway was partly the result of applying surface warfare doctrine to an operational environment defined increasingly by air power. Another group of interpretations focused on the limitations of Japanese naval aviation. These assessments highlight several interrelated issues: pilot fatigue, insufficient replacement cycles, maintenance constraints, and the strain of managing long-distance operations without adequate logistical depth. The attrition of experienced personnel in the months leading up to Midway had reduced the qualitative advantage Japan held early in the war. Although the First Air Fleet retained skilled aviators, the cumulative effects of successive operations had narrowed the margin of superiority. Maintenance crews aboard carriers worked under continuous pressure with limited spare parts, reducing the efficiency of aircraft turnover during high-tempo operations. This interpretation views Midway as a turning point, where operational strain reached a level that undermined the fleet's capacity to absorb unexpected shocks. A different interpretive school, shaped largely by American and later international historians, emphasizes the role of intelligence. These analyses highlight that American code-breaking efforts effectively eliminated the strategic secrecy upon which Operation MI depended. From this perspective, the Japanese plan, though coherent within its own assumptions, was fatally compromised by intelligence penetration. The Americans were able to position their carriers in advance, prepare their defenses, and time their attacks with knowledge unavailable to the Japanese. This interpretation views the Japanese defeat not merely as a consequence of operational errors, but as the culmination of an intelligence imbalance that shaped the strategic environment long before the first aircraft launched. Complementing this perspective are interpretations that examine gaps in Japanese reconnaissance doctrine. These analyses highlight the insufficient number of long-range scouting aircraft, the timing of search plane launches, and the limited coverage of key ocean sectors. They note that reconnaissance responsibilities were distributed across units with varying capabilities, creating inconsistencies in coverage. The delayed launch of a critical float plane on the morning of 4th of June is frequently cited as an example of how procedural adherence and minor disruptions can influence strategic outcomes. This view emphasizes that the Japanese reliance on confirmatory reconnaissance, designed to validate existing expectations rather than explore alternative scenarios, contributed to the failure to detect American carriers in time. Revisionist interpretations within Japanese scholarship have also explored command structure and decision-making. These analyses argued that the division of authority between the Naval General Staff and the combined fleet created structural friction that influenced planning and execution. Yamamoto's position, operating from a distant flagship, introduced communication delays at critical moments. Meanwhile, Nagumo's authority aboard the carrier flagship was constrained by the need to adhere to Yamamoto's overarching plan. The absence of a unified, flexible command structure contributed to slow decision-making during the morning of 4 June. This interpretation frames the defeat not solely as a tactical event, but as a reflection of institutional organization that struggled to manage the complexity of large-scale carrier operations. Other interpretations consider the technological aspects of the engagement. Scholars examining aircraft performance, ordnance handling, and deck operations note that the Japanese carriers operated with exposed ordnance on crowded hangar decks during the moments when the American dive bombers arrived. The vulnerability of carrier hangars to bomb-induced fires, combined with the presence of fuel lines and improperly secured munitions, amplified the damage. These analyses underscore the operational risks inherent in the process of rearming aircraft under time pressure. The American dive bombers did not sink the carriers through weight of explosives alone. Rather, they struck at moments when the carrier's internal configurations made them exceptionally vulnerable. Further interpretations emphasize the role of American tactical adaptation. American commanders had learned from earlier engagements in the Pacific and adjusted their tactics accordingly. At Midway, the Americans coordinated attacks from multiple altitudes, forcing Japanese fighters to engage at lower levels, while higher altitude dive bombers approached undetected. This adaptation exploited the structural limitations of Japanese combat air patrol arrangements. These analyses argue that the battle reflected not only Japanese errors but also American learning, signaling a shift in the balance of tactical innovation. A more recent interpretive approach examines the broader strategic context of the war. From this perspective, Midway represents a point where Japan's expansion had reached the limits of its logistical and operational capacity. The operation sought to extend the defensive perimeter and deliver another decisive blow, but the empire lacked the resources to sustain its expansion indefinitely. Midway, thus, becomes a reflection of structural overextension. The defeat did not occur simply because of errors during the battle. It occurred because the operation itself was born from a strategic framework stretched beyond sustainable limits. Despite the diversity of interpretations, a consistent theme emerges across scholarly analyses. The Japanese defeat at Midway arose from a combination of structural, doctrinal, operational, and intelligence-based factors. No single explanation provides a complete account. Instead, the interpretations collectively illustrate how the outcome resulted from interdependent weaknesses intersecting with adversary strengths. The Japanese command entered the battle with coherent planning and capable forces, yet the assumptions underlying the operation were vulnerable to disruption. Once those assumptions failed, the structure of the plan provided limited capacity for adaptation. Midway thus occupies a unique place in military historiography. It is not interpreted solely as a tactical encounter or as a failure of command judgment. Instead, it is understood as a moment in which underlying forces, doctrine, intelligence, logistics, command structure, and technological capability interacted to produce an outcome that reshaped the strategic trajectory of the Pacific War. The interpretations of the battle reflect this complexity, offering perspectives that continue to inform the study of decision-making and operational design in modern military contexts. The modern understanding of the Battle of Midway from the Japanese perspective rests on a wide array of sources, methodologies, and analytical tools that have allowed historians to reconstruct events with precision unavailable to participants at the time. Unlike contemporary observers within the Imperial Japanese Navy, who relied on partial reports and fragmented signals intelligence, historical researchers benefit from post-war document recovery, comparative archival study, oral history projects, and technological forms of analysis that extend well beyond the paper records of 1942. The methods used to assemble this historical record reveal not only the facts of the battle, but also the limitations and distortions inherent in wartime documentation. By examining how this information has been gathered, verified, and synthesized, the development of the modern historical narrative becomes an essential component of understanding Midway itself. The primary foundation of historical knowledge about Midway consists of naval documents preserved from the Imperial Japanese Navy. These include operational orders, ship logs, flag officer memoranda, after-action reports, and daily records from carrier and cruiser divisions. Their survival was uneven. Many documents were lost during the war's later stages, destroyed in combat, or intentionally burned during evacuation efforts. The documents that remain often originate from lower-level units whose records were not prioritized for destruction. As a result, historians reconstruct the broader operational picture by extrapolating from surviving fragments, cross-referencing them with American records, and analyzing internal consistency. This method allows researchers to reconstruct the decision-making environment aboard Japanese command ships with reasonable accuracy, despite the gaps in documentation. Post-war interrogations of surviving Japanese officers form another major component of the historical record. Conducted by American naval intelligence teams shortly after the war, these interviews sought to understand operational planning, decision-making processes, and the technical details of Japanese carrier operations. The interrogations were generally structured, with questions designed to clarify specific incidents, timings, and command relationships. Although these accounts rely on human memory, which can be influenced by stress, retrospective interpretation, and incomplete recall, they provide context unavailable in surviving documents. Cross-comparison between the statements of multiple officers reduces the risk of individual distortion and allows researchers to distinguish between shared recollections and isolated interpretations. American operational records provide additional verification. Unlike Japanese documents, many American logs, intelligence summaries, and code-breaking reports survived intact. These documents include detailed records of reconnaissance flights, carrier movements, attack timings, radio intercepts, and damage assessments. Because the two sides observed the same events from different angles, comparison of American and Japanese records allows historians to establish precise timelines. For example, discrepancies between Japanese strike launch times and American attack arrival times can be resolved through mutual corroboration. This comparative analysis offers a methodological advantage. Inconsistencies in one set of records often become clear when matched against the other. Code-breaking archives constitute another essential tool in reconstructing the Japanese perspective. While Japanese planners were unaware that their codes had been compromised, the post-war release of American cryptographic files provides insight into what U.S. commanders knew and when they knew it. These files reveal how American interpretations of Japanese signals shaped their preparations and responses. From a methodological standpoint, these records serve a dual purpose. They illuminate American actions while clarifying why Japanese forces encountered conditions they had not anticipated. The integration of cryptographic archives into the historical narrative allows researchers to differentiate between what Japanese commanders believed they faced and what the Americans had in fact prepared. The technical analysis of wreck sites offers another source of historical information. Although the main Midway battlefield lies at ocean depths that long hindered investigation, modern deep-sea exploration technologies have located and photographed several key wrecks. High-resolution imaging conducted by research vessels and remotely operated vehicles has documented the condition of the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu on the ocean floor. Structural damage patterns visible in these images confirm accounts of bomb impacts, internal explosions, and progressive fires. These findings corroborate eyewitness descriptions and provide physical evidence of how damage propagated through the ship's hangar decks and fuel systems. The scientific examination of wrecks also reveals patterns of structural collapse not fully understood at the time, enriching assessments of the carrier vulnerability. Naval cartography and geospatial reconstruction represent additional methodological tools. By digitizing surviving maps, logs, and flight path diagrams, researchers can recreate fleet movements across the Pacific with a level of precision impossible during the battle. These reconstructions account for wind patterns, fuel consumption, aircraft range limitations, and timing sequences. They allow historians to visualize how reconnaissance gaps developed, how search sectors overlapped or failed to overlap, and how the positions of the American and Japanese fleets evolved relative to one another. Such visual reconstructions clarify why Japanese reconnaissance failed to detect American carriers in time, demonstrating the spatial constraints that shaped Nagumo's decision-making. Oral histories collected from Japanese pilots, deck crews, and support personnel add further depth. These testimonies, gathered decades after the battle, often focus on individual experiences rather than strategic analysis. Nonetheless, they provide valuable insight into the operational environment aboard Japanese carriers. Pilots describe the difficulty of rigorous launch schedules, the strain of prolonged combat readiness, and the limited visibility of the broader tactical picture available at their level. Deck crews recount the intense workload required to rearm aircraft and the dangers associated with managing ordnance under time pressure. The consistency of these accounts strengthens their credibility, illustrating the human dimensions of operations that official documents seldom describe. Comparative analysis between Japanese and American technological capabilities forms another aspect of historical methodology. Scholars examine aircraft performance charts, ordnance specifications, and engineering reports to illuminate how material differences shape the battle. For example, the American SBD dive bombers' stability and accuracy contributed to the precision of the attacks on Japanese carriers. Conversely, the vulnerability of Japanese carrier hangars to fire exacerbated by fuel line design and ventilation arrangements, explains how relatively few bombs produce catastrophic results. These technical evaluations supplement tactical and doctrinal analyses by clarifying the physical conditions under which the battle occurred. The use of simulation and wargaming adds an interpretive methodological layer. Naval academies, research institutions, and historical analysts have conducted numerous Midway simulations using reconstructed data. These simulations test the resilience of Japanese operational assumptions under varying conditions. They explore alternative reconnaissance timings, weather patterns, and ordnance handling sequences to evaluate whether different decisions might have altered the outcome. While simulations cannot replicate the uncertainty of real combat, they highlight the structural vulnerabilities embedded in the Japanese plan. They also clarify that the outcome resulted not from a single mistake, but from the interaction of multiple factors. Linguistic and translation analysis also play a role in understanding the historical record. Japanese naval terminology, abbreviations, and doctrinal language require careful interpretation to avoid misreading operational intent. The translation of terms relating to reconnaissance, strike formation, and command directives affects how historians interpret the decision-making process. Modern scholars collaborate with linguists to ensure that nuances in Japanese command language are preserved in English language analyses. Accurate translation is essential, as differences in terminology can alter interpretations of the timing, rationale, or sequence of actions. Finally, historiographical synthesis integrates these discrete methodologies into a coherent narrative. This process involves weighing the reliability of sources, identifying potential biases, correcting inconsistencies, and comparing evidence across multiple domains. The Japanese perspective on Midway cannot be reconstructed through documentation alone. It emerges from the interplay of archival study, technical analysis, oral history, and geospatial reconstruction. The strength of the modern historical account lies in its multidisciplinary foundation, which permits a more nuanced understanding than any single source could provide. Through these methods, the Battle of Midway becomes not merely a record of tactical events, but a case study in the practice of military history. The combination of traditional archival research with modern technological tools has reshaped understanding of the battle, shedding light on the constraints, assumptions, and pressures that shape Japanese decisions. The historical record, therefore, is not static. It reflects ongoing efforts to refine knowledge through increasingly sophisticated analytical methods. Midway continues to serve as a benchmark for the integration of documentary study, scientific inquiry, and interpretive scholarship in the reconstruction of complex military events. The modern reconstruction of the Battle of Midway from the Japanese perspective rests on a foundation of factual material supported by surviving documents, comparative archival analysis, and physical evidence recovered through deep-sea exploration. Yet, despite the considerable detail available to historians, significant gaps remain in the historical record. These gaps arise from the destruction of documents, the incomplete nature of wartime reporting, the limitations of human memory, and the structural opacity of command networks during the battle. The distinction between what is firmly established and what remains uncertain is essential for understanding the Japanese experience of Midway and for framing the limits of historical interpretation. Several elements of the battle are known with clarity. The composition of the Japanese fleet, its operational objectives, and the sequence of planned actions were documented in pre-battle operational orders preserved in surviving archives. These documents outline the intended movements of the First Air Fleet, the invasion group, the Aleutian diversion, and the supporting main body under Admiral Yamamoto. They established the doctrinal framework that shaped the operational design and clarified the assumptions underlying Japanese planning. Fleet movement logs, where preserved, provide reliable evidence of timing, speed, and navigational decisions as the Japanese forces advanced toward Midway. The timing of the initial Japanese airstrike on Midway is also well established. Launch times, aircraft composition, target assignments, and attack results can be reconstructed from the combination of pilot debriefs, Midway's defensive accounts, and American radar logs. The sequence of events surrounding the first strike reveals that the attack inflicted damage but failed to achieve the level of neutralization expected in the Japanese operational plan. This fact is corroborated by both sides' accounts, eliminating ambiguity regarding the outcome of the opening phase of the battle. The destruction of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu is likewise supported by mutually reinforcing evidence. American attack records describe the approach and execution of the dive bomber strikes, while Japanese survivors' accounts detail the rapid spread of fires and internal explosions triggered by exposed ordnance and fuel lines. Deep-sea imaging of the wrecks has confirmed penetration patterns consistent with the bomb strikes described in historical accounts. The timing of the attacks, the extent of the damage, and the inability of the carriers to recover remain part of the firmly established historical record. However, other areas contain substantial ambiguity. One of the most significant unresolved questions concerns the precise state of ordnance aboard the carriers at the moment of the American attacks. Surviving Japanese documents indicate that the aircraft were in the process of rearmament, but the exact distribution of torpedoes, bombs, and partially fueled aircraft remains uncertain. Eyewitness accounts differ in detail, reflecting the chaotic conditions on the hangar decks. Some surviving officers recalled the presence of large quantities of exposed ordnance, while others emphasized that the rearming process had not yet progressed far enough to create hazardous concentrations. The physical evidence from wreck sites, while informative, does not provide sufficient detail to resolve these discrepancies. As a result, historians can describe the general conditions aboard the carriers, but cannot state with certainty the exact configuration of ordnance when the attacks occurred. Another enduring uncertainty involves the delayed reconnaissance report from the Tone float plane. Records confirm that the aircraft launched late and transmitted delayed sightings, but the precise reasons for the delay remain only partially documented. Mechanical issues, launch timing procedures, and weather conditions have all been cited as contributing factors, yet the relative weight of these factors is unclear. The float plane crew's post-war statements provide some insight, but cannot fully reconstruct the technical difficulties encountered. The consequences of the delay are well established, reduced situational awareness at a critical moment. But the root cause remains partially obscured. Uncertainty also characterizes the communications environment aboard Nagumo's flagship during the crucial decision-making window. Fragmentary signal logs indicate that Nagumo received incomplete information regarding the presence of American carriers, but gaps in the logs prevent reconstruction of the exact sequence of message delivery. It is known that conflicting reports arrived within minutes of one another, creating a narrowing window for decision-making. The precise content of internal staff discussions, however, remains undocumented. Surviving officers provided differing recollections of the level of urgency, the presentation of options, and the weight assigned to various pieces of information. These discrepancies reflect the difficulty of reconstructing fast-moving command deliberations under combat conditions. The intentions of Admiral Yamamoto during the later stages of the battle represent another area of partial uncertainty. Although signal logs preserve his orders to regroup and attempt a surface engagement, the degree to which he believes such an engagement remained feasible is unclear. Post-war statements suggest that Yamamoto understood the limitations imposed by the loss of air cover, yet wartime documentation does not explicitly record his assessment of the situation. This gap reflects the broader difficulty of interpreting command intent during periods of rapid operational collapse. The motivations behind certain doctrinal decisions also remain partly obscure. For example, the decision to maintain the rearming process after receiving initial reports of American ships has been attributed to doctrinal rigidity, uncertainty regarding enemy composition, or the need to recover aircraft returning from Midway. Each interpretation is consistent with fragmentary evidence, but none can be confirmed conclusively. The lack of comprehensive documentation of Nagumo's internal reasoning prevents historians from reconstructing a complete decision matrix. Further gaps exist in the experiences of lower deck personnel. While some oral histories provide vivid descriptions of life aboard the carriers during the battle, the sample size remains limited. Many deck crew members did not survive, and those who did often described only small segments of the operational environment. As a result, historians possess detailed accounts of certain events but lack a comprehensive depiction of the full range of human experiences across all carrier divisions. The broader operational context also contains unresolved questions. The Japanese expected the Aleutian diversion to shape American responses, yet surviving documents provide limited insight into how Japanese commanders interpreted the absence of American reaction. Similar uncertainty surrounds the extent to which Japanese commanders understood the operational implications of American radar capabilities. Pre-war documents acknowledge radar as an emerging technology, but wartime assessments of American proficiency remain sparse. Despite these uncertainties, the established facts provide a coherent framework for understanding the Japanese experience at Midway. The known elements allow historians to reconstruct the sequence of events, identify key decision points, and analyze the structural vulnerabilities embedded in the operational plan. The remaining gaps illustrate the inherent limitations of wartime documentation and the difficulty of reconstructing decision-making environments shaped by incomplete information, time pressure, and rapidly shifting circumstances. The distinction between what is known and what remains unverifiable underscores the complexity of Midway as a historical subject. The battle's outcome can be described with confidence, but certain internal dynamics of Japanese command, decision-making, and specific technical conditions aboard the carriers remain beyond complete reconstruction. These gaps do not diminish the broader historical understanding, but instead emphasize the need for careful interpretation grounded in available evidence. They illustrate the inherent challenges of reconstructing military history and the importance of acknowledging the limits of what can be confidently asserted based on the surviving record. The human dimension of the Japanese experience at Midway emerges through the accumulated testimonies, personnel records, and post-war interviews that describe the conditions aboard the carriers during the operation. Although the strategic and operational contours of the battle are often examined at the level of fleet movements and command decisions, the outcome was shaped in part by the daily responsibilities and physical demands placed on the individuals who served within the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier air groups and support units. These accounts, though varied in detail, collectively illustrate the strain, discipline, and operational pressures that characterized life aboard the carriers during the days leading to the battle and during the battle itself. The air crews who launched the opening strike on Midway had experienced a near-continuous operational tempo since the beginning of the war. Pilot logs and training reports reveal that many aviators had participated in earlier campaigns, including operations in the South Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and Southeast Asia. The cumulative effect of these missions shaped their physical and mental readiness. Pilots operated under tight schedules that left little room for recuperation. They maintained proficiency through continuous briefings, navigational preparation, and inspections, often working late into the night as planning intensified. These tasks reflected the discipline expected within the 1st Air Fleet, yet the fatigue accumulated over months of sustained operations contributed to the limits of human endurance encountered at Midway. Flight deck crews carried responsibilities that were both physically demanding and technically complex. Their duties included maneuvering aircraft across narrow deck spaces, securing munitions, refueling planes, and preparing aircraft for launch sequences. Personnel records document the extensive training required for these tasks, emphasizing coordination and safety procedures. The paced rhythm of launch and recovery operations depended on their precision. The conditions on deck during the opening hours of the battle, marked by heat, exhaust fumes, and the movement of fully armed aircraft, required focused attention under circumstances shaped by urgency and limited time. The rearming sequence that unfolded during the morning of 4th of June placed additional strain on these crews, who faced the challenge of shifting ordnance types under a compressed timeline. Below deck, maintenance personnel worked in confined spaces where ventilation was limited and noise levels remained high. Their responsibilities involved inspecting engines, repairing airframes, servicing fuel systems, and coordinating spare parts. Maintenance logs indicate that shortages of replacement components increased the necessity of improvised repairs, requiring crews to prioritize essential tasks. Working conditions were often dictated by the operational schedule, leaving personnel with narrow windows in which to complete repairs before aircraft were needed for subsequent missions. The complexity of these tasks reflected the technological sophistication of carrier aviation, while the limited number of trained maintenance specialists placed additional pressure on available personnel. Command staff aboard the carriers faced distinct responsibilities associated with planning, reconnaissance interpretation, and tactical coordination. Officers worked within the constraints imposed by limited information, rigid timelines, and doctrinal expectations. Their duties required synthesizing reconnaissance reports, assessing attack results, and preparing follow-up actions. The rapid pace at which information arrived, sometimes incomplete or contradictory, created a decision-making environment shaped by uncertainty. This environment introduced stress that, although less physical than that experienced by deck and maintenance crews, carried its own weight. Post-war accounts describe the difficulty of reaching clear conclusions under the pressure of conflicting priorities, such as preparing for a second strike on Midway while awaiting confirmation of American carrier movements. The experience of the carrier's signal personnel offers further insight into the human realities of the battle. These individuals managed communication lines, encoded and decoded messages, and interpreted signals from reconnaissance aircraft and fleet units. Their work required concentration, accuracy, and adherence to procedural discipline. Signal logs from the morning of the battle reveal a sequence of messages arriving in rapid succession, sometimes overlapping and occasionally contradicting one another. Signal personnel faced the challenge of processing these reports quickly while maintaining operational security and clarity. Their efforts shaped the information available to command officers, influencing decisions made under time pressure. As American aircraft approached the Japanese carriers, the burden on defensive teams increased. Fighter pilots assigned to combat air patrol flew intercept missions that required navigating through rapidly changing clouds and maintaining altitude discipline. Their task involved identifying incoming aircraft, coordinating with other fighters, and conserving fuel for extended engagements. The pressure of repeated interceptions, combined with the unpredictability of attack patterns, created a demanding operational environment. The descent of many fighters to engage low-flying torpedo planes left higher altitudes unmonitored, a condition that contributed to the subsequent vulnerability of the carriers to dive bomber attacks. The experiences of deck crews during the moments of attack were characterized by sudden transitions from ordered activity to chaotic emergency response. Accounts from survivors describe the rapid spread of fires sparked by bomb impacts, the collapse of structural components, and the difficulty of navigating smoke-filled corridors. Fire suppression teams attempted to contain flames using available equipment, but internal damage to fuel lines and ventilation systems compounded the challenge. These efforts were conducted under hazardous conditions, as the presence of munitions and aviation fuel increased the risk of secondary explosions. The firefighting efforts aboard the carriers illustrate the professionalism of the crews, who worked to preserve their vessels despite overwhelming circumstances. Medical personnel faced similarly demanding conditions. Their responsibilities expanded rapidly as casualties increased. They operated in makeshift treatment areas where lighting, ventilation, and space were limited. Medical logs indicate that personnel treated a wide range of injuries, including burns, shrapnel wounds, and respiratory complications caused by smoke inhalation. Their work occurred amid the broader instability of the ships, where structural damage and movement created additional hazards. The medical team's efforts reflect the human cost of the battle and the rapid adjustment required to meet rising demands. Beyond the immediate conditions of combat, the psychological strain of the battle manifested in ways that are less visible in official records but present in personal testimonies. Some survivors described a sense of disorientation as the structured operations of the fleet gave way to rapidly deteriorating conditions. The collapse of communication channels, the loss of familiar command structures, and the visible destruction of the carriers produced a psychological impact shaped by the abruptness of the reversal. While discipline remained strong, the shock of unexpected loss influenced the morale of surviving personnel during the hours following the attacks. The transition to evacuation procedures introduced another set of human challenges. Crews followed predetermined protocols, assisting wounded personnel, securing essential documents, and attempting to preserve equipment where possible. The evacuation efforts occurred under conditions of increasing instability as fires intensified and structural integrity deteriorated. Survivors described the difficulty of navigating through damaged corridors, the pressure to adhere to procedure despite rising urgency, and the need to coordinate with other vessels engaged in rescue operations. Destroyers moved quickly to recover survivors, yet the number of available rescue assets and the speed of the carrier's deterioration limited the number that could be saved. The human realities of the carrier crews at Midway reflect the intersection of discipline, skill, and operational strain. Their experiences illustrate the challenges inherent in carrier warfare during a period of evolving technology and doctrine. While strategic analyses focus on planning assumptions, intelligence gaps, and command decisions, the outcome of the battle was shaped in part by the physical and mental endurance of the individuals who executed those plans. Their contributions, though often overshadowed by broader historical narratives, remain essential for understanding the Japanese perspective on Midway. The human dimension underscores the complexity of naval operations and the limits of human capacity under the pressures of sustained combat. The aftermath of the Midway operation produced strategic consequences that extended far beyond the immediate loss of 4 Japanese carriers. From the Japanese perspective, the battle marked a turning point in the Pacific War, not because it ended Japan's capacity to wage offensive operations, which continued for several months, but because it fundamentally altered the balance between operational ambition and available resources. The Imperial Japanese Navy entered the battle with a doctrine built around decisive engagement and strategic initiative. After Midway, the feasibility of that doctrine diminished as Japan faced rising material constraints, shrinking operational flexibility, and the erosion of its experienced air groups. The consequences unfolded through changes in fleet composition, strategic posture, industrial capacity, and geopolitical momentum. The most immediate consequence was the loss of the First Air Fleet's core carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with a substantial portion of their air crews. These carriers had formed the strike capability behind Japan's early war successes, enabling long-range operations across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Their destruction altered the fleet's composition in ways that could not be offset in the short term. Although Japan possessed other carriers, the lost vessels carried the most experienced officers, pilots, deck crews, and maintenance specialists. Training new aviators required time, fuel, and instructional infrastructure on a scale Japan could not expand rapidly. Personnel records indicate that replacement programs were underway before Midway, but these were insufficient to compensate for the loss of veteran aviators. The qualitative decline in Japan's air groups became evident in subsequent battles, particularly in the Solomon Islands. Strategically, the loss of carrier strength restricted Japan's ability to conduct large-scale offensive operations. Prior to Midway, Japan had planned additional expansions to consolidate its defensive perimeter. These included operations against Fiji, Samoa, and potential advances toward Hawaii or the Australian mainland. Following Midway, the feasibility of these operations declined sharply. Planning documents from late 1942 indicate that the Naval General Staff shifted focus from expansion to consolidation, emphasizing the need to reinforce key positions rather than pursue new offensives. The combined fleet, deprived of its principal strike arm, lacked the capability to impose its strategic will across the Pacific. Midway also accelerated the shift in momentum toward the United States. American industry had already begun producing new carriers and aircraft at a pace that surpassed Japanese expectations. Prior to the battle, Japan believed it possessed a narrowing but manageable window in which to force a conclusive outcome before American industrial output reached full strength. The loss at Midway shortened this window dramatically. By late 1942, the U.S. Navy commissioned new carriers that restored and expanded its operational capacity. In contrast, Japan's efforts to replace its lost carriers encountered industrial constraints related to steel allocation, shipyard capacity, and competing wartime demands. The post-Midway shipbuilding program included the construction of new fleet carriers and the conversion of existing hulls, but these efforts progressed slowly. The industrial disparity between the two nations sharpened the strategic imbalance. The battle's outcome also reshaped Japan's defensive posture. The original plan for Midway aimed to extend the defensive perimeter eastward, creating a buffer that would protect Japan's vital lines of communication. With the failure of that plan, Japan's defensive perimeter remained static and increasingly vulnerable. The Central Pacific remained under American control, and Midway continued to serve as a forward base for reconnaissance, air operations, and surface patrols. Japan now faced the prospect of defending a perimeter stretched across thousands of miles without the carrier strength required to respond flexibly to American advances. The consequences for naval doctrine were equally significant. The defeat challenged the viability of the pre-war decisive battle doctrine that had guided Japanese naval planning for decades. This doctrine envisioned a single, climactic engagement in which Japanese forces would destroy the American fleet through a combination of attrition and a final decisive strike. Midway demonstrated the vulnerability of this doctrine in the era of carrier warfare. The Japanese fleet, configured for a decisive battle, encountered an adversary whose operational decisions were shaped by intelligence, flexibility, and timing rather than predictable movements. Post-war analyses by Japanese officers acknowledged that the doctrine required adaptation to new technological and operational realities. However, during the war, doctrinal revisions occurred slowly and could not fully compensate for the loss of experienced personnel or the decline in strategic initiative. The aftermath also influenced the morale and internal cohesion of the Imperial Japanese Navy. While discipline remained strong, the loss of 4 carriers and the heavy casualties among air crew created a psychological impact within the fleet. Personnel memorials, mourning ceremonies, and internal communications reflect a recognition of the scale of the loss. Command discussions in the months following the battle reveal increased caution in operational planning and heightened concern about the sustainability of Japan's naval strategy. Although Japanese forces continued to conduct effective operations in certain theaters, the internal confidence that had characterized early war campaigns diminished. The broader geopolitical consequences of Midway extended beyond the naval sphere. The battle signaled to Allied nations that Japan's expansion had reached its limit and that the momentum of the war could shift. It strengthened the resolve of the United States and its allies, contributing to strategic decisions that emphasized a sustained counteroffensive in both the Central and Southwest Pacific. The subsequent Guadalcanal campaign, initiated months after Midway, demonstrated the growing American capacity to project power and challenge Japanese defenses. Japan's inability to prevent the American landing on Guadalcanal reflected the diminished flexibility of its navy and the consequences of the losses sustained at Midway. The diplomatic implications of the defeat also shaped Japan's wartime position. Although Japan maintained alliances with Germany and Italy, the defeat at Midway limited its ability to coordinate or influence broader Axis strategy. Communications with German leadership reveal that Japan continued to focus on the Pacific theater, while Germany sought increased coordination against the Soviet Union. The inability to secure a decisive victory at Midway weakened Japan's negotiating position within the Axis framework and increased the divergence of strategic priorities. Economically, the defeat imposed indirect consequences. Japan's war economy depended heavily on secure maritime supply routes for fuel, raw materials, and industrial components. The loss of carrier strength reduced Japan's capacity to protect these routes effectively. Although the immediate effect on shipping was limited, the long-term consequence was an erosion of Japan's ability to defend its commerce as American submarine patrols intensified. By undermining the offensive capabilities of the Japanese fleet, the defeat at Midway indirectly accelerated the vulnerability of Japan's supply lines. In a broader military context, Midway marked the beginning of a strategic shift in which Japan transitioned from offensive expansion to defensive attrition. While Japanese forces continued to achieve tactical successes in some engagements, the strategic trajectory of the war increasingly favored the United States. The initiative that had characterized Japan's early operations diminished, replaced by the need to respond to American advances along multiple axes. The loss at Midway did not end Japan's capacity to fight, but it restricted the options available to its commanders and constrained the operational flexibility required for strategic adaptation. Midway's consequences extended into the long-term development of naval warfare. The battle reinforced the centrality of carrier aviation as the dominant force in naval operations. For Japan, the loss of experienced aviators exacerbated the growing disparity in pilot training quality between the two sides. Training programs expanded, but the shortage of experienced instructors and limited availability of fuel for training flights restricted their effectiveness. The quality of Japanese aviation declined steadily in the months following Midway, reducing the effectiveness of future operations and contributing to cumulative losses that further diminished Japan's strategic capacity. Taken together, the consequences of the Battle of Midway shaped the trajectory of the Pacific War in ways that reflected both immediate losses and long-term structural effects. The destruction of the carriers removed Japan's most effective instrument of power projection. The loss of experienced personnel weakened the qualitative strength of its air groups. The strategic initiative shifted decisively to the United States, allowing for coordinated counteroffensives that targeted Japan's defensive perimeter. Industrial disparities became increasingly pronounced, doctrinal limitations became more apparent, and Japan's ability to adapt to evolving conditions diminished. From the Japanese perspective, Midway marked the point at which strategic reality diverged sharply from wartime ambition, setting the course for the protracted struggle that followed. The Battle of Midway generated a series of operational and doctrinal lessons that shaped subsequent Japanese military thinking, both during the remaining years of the Pacific War and in post-war evaluations conducted by surviving officers. These lessons reflect not only the tactical and operational shortcomings revealed during the battle, but also deeper structural issues related to doctrine, command organization, intelligence assessment, and logistical capacity. When viewed from the Japanese perspective, these lessons illustrate how the assumptions guiding pre-war naval strategy required re-evaluation in the face of emerging realities in carrier warfare, operational tempo, and industrial competition. One of the most significant lessons concerns the vulnerability inherent in rigid operational planning. Operation MI was constructed around a sequence of actions designed to shape enemy behavior, yet it allocated limited flexibility for responding to the unanticipated developments. Japanese doctrine emphasized carefully structured operations intended to force the adversary into predictable patterns. Once American actions diverged from these expectations, the operational plan lacked mechanisms for rapid adaptation. Post-war analyses by Japanese officers emphasized that the plan's complexity, dividing forces across multiple operational zones, reduced the fleet's ability to concentrate power when conditions demanded it. The lesson derived from this experience underscores the importance of designing operational plans with built-in flexibility rather than strict sequential dependencies. The second major lesson involves reconnaissance doctrine. Japanese naval aviation relied heavily on a reconnaissance model oriented toward confirming anticipated enemy positions rather than exploring alternative possibilities. The search patterns employed during the approach to Midway reflected this doctrinal assumption. Coverage gaps, delayed launches, and the division of reconnaissance responsibilities across multiple units produced insufficient awareness of American movements. The failure to detect the American carriers in time demonstrated the need for more robust and redundant reconnaissance systems, particularly in carrier operations, where early detection was essential for tactical positioning. This lesson highlights the relationship between reconnaissance coverage and strike timing, and how limitations in one domain can undermine coherence across the entire operation. Another doctrinal lesson concerns the risks associated with carrier deck operations under conditions of uncertainty. Japanese carriers followed procedures that optimized efficiency under predictable conditions, but these procedures became a liability when the operational situation shifted rapidly. The process of rearming aircraft aboard the carriers required extensive coordination, movement of ordnance, and strict adherence to safety protocols. During the morning of 4th of June, conflicting priorities, preparing a second strike on Midway while maintaining readiness to engage American carriers, created a scenario in which ordnance remained exposed on crowded hangar decks. Post-war technical analyses emphasize the importance of minimizing the duration during which fuel lines and munitions are simultaneously exposed. The Japanese experience revealed how deck procedures must be adapted for situations in which rapid shifts in mission priorities are likely. The fourth lesson relates to command structure and decision-making authority. The separation of the combined fleet headquarters from Nagumo's carrier task force created communication delays and ambiguity regarding decision-making responsibilities. Although Yamamoto intended to exercise centralized strategic oversight, the distances separating the fleet components limited his ability to influence the battle in real time. Meanwhile, Naguma faced doctrinal and operational pressures that constrained his flexibility. The Japanese command structure lacked mechanisms to reconcile these competing demands. Post-war evaluations identified the need for clearer delegation of authority, more flexible command arrangements, and improved communication procedures to reduce latency in decision-making. Intelligence assessment also emerges as a central doctrinal lesson. Japanese intelligence analysts relied on pre-war projections and early wartime observations that no longer reflected American capabilities. The assumption that American carriers remained damaged or reluctant to engage aggressively shaped planning decisions that proved inaccurate. The failure to reassess these assumptions in light of emerging evidence, such as the American response at Coral Sea, illustrates the danger of relying on static intelligence frameworks. The lesson drawn from this experience emphasizes the need for dynamic intelligence assessments that incorporate new information and challenge pre-existing beliefs. Operational tempo represents another area of doctrinal reflection. Japanese carrier forces maintained a demanding operational schedule from the beginning of the war until Midway. This tempo strained pilots, deck crews, and maintenance personnel, reducing the margin for error during critical operations. Pilot fatigue, equipment wear, and maintenance limitations contributed to a gradual decline in overall readiness. Post-war analyses highlight the importance of maintaining operational reserves, implementing sustainable rotation cycles, and recognizing the cumulative effects of continuous operations. This lesson underscores the need for balancing aggressive strategy with the preservation of force effectiveness. The battle also highlighted the vulnerability of Japan's industrial base relative to the United States. While not an operational lesson in the immediate tactical sense, the recognition of industrial disparity influenced later assessments of wartime strategy. Japan's inability to replace carriers, aircraft, and trained aviators at the pace required to sustain protracted carrier battles revealed a structural challenge that no operational doctrine could fully compensate for. The lesson derived emphasizes the necessity of aligning military doctrine with industrial capacity, ensuring that operational planning reflects realistic expectations of equipment, replacement, and personnel training. A further doctrinal implication concerns the role of initiative in naval warfare. Japanese doctrine placed significant emphasis on seizing the initiative through preemptive strikes. This approach proved effective early in the war, but depended on accurate intelligence, concentration of force, and tight operational control. At Midway, once the Americans seized the initiative through coordinated counterstrikes, the Japanese forces struggled to regain momentum. Post-war evaluations stress that initiative in carrier warfare can shift rapidly, and that doctrine must prepare for scenarios in which the enemy acts unpredictably or gains temporary advantage. Maintaining operational reserves, preserving flexibility in launch sequencing, and decentralizing certain decision-making functions emerged as key recommendations. Technological adaptation forms another area of doctrinal reflection. The battle demonstrated the decisive impact of radar in modern naval operations. Japanese planners were aware of radar technology, but underestimated its operational effectiveness. American radar installations on Midway and aboard carriers provided early warning of incoming attacks and improved coordination of defensive responses. The post-war recognition of radar's significance influenced later assessments of Japan's technological development priorities, highlighting the need to integrate emerging technologies into operational doctrine more rapidly. Finally, the Midway experience emphasized the importance of joint operational coherence. Operation MI required coordination between naval aviation, surface forces, and amphibious units, yet the dispersion of these forces and the limited communication between them hindered cohesive action. The lesson derived from this experience stresses the need for integrated planning across operational domains, ensuring that air, surface, and amphibious components operate with shared situational awareness and mutual support. Collectively, these lessons from Midway highlight the multifaceted nature of operational failure and the complexity inherent in adapting doctrine to evolving conditions. From reconnaissance limitations to command structure, From deck operations to intelligence interpretation, the Japanese experience at Midway underscores the importance of flexibility, sustained readiness, and technological adaptation. These lessons extend beyond the specifics of the battle, informing broader principles of naval warfare and the challenges of conducting complex operations under conditions of uncertainty. In the days that followed the Battle of Midway, the remnants of the Japanese fleet withdrew across the Pacific under conditions shaped by operational fatigue, incomplete information, and the recognition that the strategic objectives of Operation MI could no longer be achieved. The surviving warships, still functional but deprived of their carrier strength, regrouped in dispersed formations as they made their way towards safer waters. The withdrawal was conducted in measured stages, with destroyers assigned to screen-damaged vessels and cruisers adjusting their positions to protect logistical units. Signals exchanged among fleet elements reflected a restrained tone, shaped by the need to preserve operational discipline, while acknowledging the collapse of the offensive. The fleet maintained its organizational structure during the retreat, yet the absence of the carriers, once the core of the First Air Fleet, altered the operational identity of the combined fleet. The process of reporting the outcome to senior leadership in Tokyo unfolded gradually. Communications from the combined fleet conveyed the loss of the carriers, the failure of the invasion plan, and the decision to withdraw. Initial reports emphasized the scale of American resistance and the unexpected presence of U.S. carrier forces. Later transmissions provided more detailed accounts of the sequence of events, including the damage assessments and casualty figures for each carrier. The Naval General Staff received these communications with a mixture of concern and silence, recognizing the strategic implications, yet refraining from immediate policy adjustments. The internal memoranda that followed documented the losses in formal terms, but avoided extended interpretation, reflecting a wartime environment in which acknowledging the full scope of the defeat risked undermining broader strategic confidence. Within the fleet, the loss of personnel created a tangible absence. The disappearance of experienced aviators, deck crews, and staff officers altered the dynamics aboard surviving vessels. Commanding officers reported the need to reorganize departments, adjust personnel responsibilities, and integrate replacement officers into positions for which they had limited preparation. These adjustments occurred quietly, without public acknowledgement, as the fleet sought to restore a functional structure while coping with reduced manpower. The process of reorganizing air groups required additional training programs and revised deployment schedules, contributing to delays in future operations. The absence of veteran pilots, many of whom had participated in earlier campaigns, created a generational gap within the Naval Air Service that would shape Japanese aviation for the remainder of the war. The broader institutional response emphasized continuity. The combined fleet maintained its strategic posture, preparing for upcoming operations in the South Pacific, even as the implications of Midway became increasingly apparent. Staff meetings recorded in surviving documents continued to outline objectives for upcoming campaigns, focusing on the defense of key positions and the reinforcement of areas vulnerable to American advances. Yet beneath the institutional formality lay a shift in strategic confidence. Officers who participated in post-war interviews described a change in atmosphere following the fleet's return, noting that conversations aboard command vessels became more restrained, and that discussions of the battle occurred primarily in technical rather than evaluative terms. Public reporting of the operation within Japan remained limited. Newspapers published brief statements describing an engagement near Midway and claiming modest tactical achievements, without acknowledging the loss of the carriers. This approach reflected wartime information policies designed to maintain public morale and prevent the dissemination of strategically sensitive information. Within military circles, discussions of Midway remained highly structured, with the focus placed on specific operational issues rather than on broader strategic consequences. This restraint contributed to what some post-war analysts would later describe as a historical silence surrounding the battle during the remaining years of the war. The survivors of the carrier crews faced varied transitions upon their return. Some were reassigned to shore-based aviation units, others incorporated into training programs designed to prepare new pilots, and some reassigned to surface vessels. Personnel records indicate that survivors of the First Air Fleet brought valuable experience to these roles, yet their numbers were too few to offset the losses sustained. Their recollections, recorded decades later, describe a subdued period following their return, a time marked by reflection, routine duties, and the gradual recognition that the operational environment had changed. The aftermath extended into the strategic fabric of the Navy. The combined fleet recognized that the loss of 4 carriers altered its ability to shape the broader war. Planning documents created in the months following the battle reflect this shift. They emphasize defensive preparations, the need for redistribution of remaining assets, and the importance of maintaining operational economy. While offensive operations continued in various theaters, the absence of a fully functional carrier strike force influenced the scope and tempo of Japanese strategic planning. As months passed, the memory of Midway remained present within the fleet, but seldom discussed openly. The battle's impact became visible not through verbal acknowledgement, but through the operational adjustments that followed. Adjustments in training pipelines, pilot deployment, reconnaissance doctrine, and fleet organization. The transformation of the combined fleet from an offensive force into a progressively defensive one unfolded gradually yet consistently, shaped by constraints that could be traced to the losses sustained during the Midway operation. In this sense, the aftermath of Midway was defined less by dramatic declarations than by a steady, quiet recognition of altered circumstances. The silence that followed the operation within Japanese command circles reflected not denial, but the need to maintain continuity amid changing realities. The fleet continued to prepare for future engagements, yet the boundaries of what was achievable had shifted. Midway's influence persisted not through immediate policy shifts, but through the structural limitations that shaped every subsequent decision. The operation's failure became part of the fleet's internal landscape, a constant, unspoken reminder of the vulnerability inherent in overextended strategy and the narrowing space for operational initiative. The wide expanse of the Pacific in the weeks after Midway reflected a transition that unfolded without ceremony. The sea lines once crossed by Japanese carrier groups in confident formation now carried dispersed ships returning to their home ports. Reports continued to circulate, procedures continued to be followed, and naval operations persisted across distant theaters. Yet the tempo of the war had shifted. The momentum that characterized earlier campaigns no longer defined the fleet's posture. Instead, the operational focus gradually moved from expansion to preservation, shaped by the need to adapt to diminishing resources and evolving strategic pressures. Within naval headquarters, maps of the Pacific remained unchanged in outward appearance, but the strategic calculations behind them had altered. The loss of the carriers introduced new constraints that permeated planning discussions and shaped future operations. Training centers began adjusting their programs to accommodate the demands of more extensive pilot preparation. Shore installations increased their role in defensive air operations. The pace of industrial output continued, but its capacity could not replicate the experience lost or restore the tempo the fleet had once maintained. Across the ocean, American forces began to advance in ways that reflected the growing imbalance in naval power. Future engagements would unfold in the Solomons, the Gilberts, and the Marianas, each shaped by the realities revealed at Midway. Japanese forces would continue to fight with discipline and determination, yet the structural limitations imposed by the losses at Midway increasingly influenced their operational options. For those who served aboard the carriers lost during the battle, the memory of Midway remained tied to the disciplined routines of their daily duties, the demands of combat readiness, and the rapid transition from ordered operations to irreversible crisis. Their experiences formed part of the broader historical trajectory that reshaped the course of the Pacific War. The silence that followed Midway contained the weight of recognition. The battle had concluded, but its influence endured.